She had been counting things since she was 7 years old. It started with the number of steps between her bedroom door and the kitchen. 14, if she walked along the wall where the floorboards didn't creak. 17, if she went through the middle of the hall. She counted, because counting gave her something to do with her hands when her mind had too much to hold. She counted because numbers didn't lie, didn't change, didn't look at her the way people did. The morning of her bonding ceremony, she counted the candles in the great hall. 312. She stood in the corridor just outside the main doors, still in her dressing gown, her hair half-pinned, her maid fussing behind her with a ribbon that kept slipping. The doors were cracked open just enough that she could see slivers of the hall, the long tables pushed to the sides, the stone floor swept clean, the candles burning in every iron holder from the floor to the rafters. 312. She memorized that number the way she memorized everything she wasn't supposed to need. Her name was Sarah Voss. She was 23 years old. Her father was a beta of middling rank, not powerful enough to be noticed, not low enough to be dismissed, lodged permanently in that uncomfortable middle space where everyone knew his name and no one cared to remember it. Her mother had married him because he was solid, safe, a man who would not leave. Sarah had inherited his face and her mother's ambition, and the combination had done her no particular favors. She was not ugly. That was the kindest thing people said about her, in the way people say the kindest things, with a small, private hesitation before the word, a breath that contains everything they chose not to say. She was not ugly. She was quiet. She was thin-wristed and dark-eyed, and she had the kind of face that people looked past when there was something more interesting in the room, which in the king's court there always was. The mate bond had found her 3 weeks before the ceremony. She'd been in the archive. She worked there, cataloging old treaties, straightening the rolls that the senior clerk couldn't be bothered to file properly. And it had arrived like a key turning in a lock she didn't know she had. A warmth behind her sternum, a pull, the specific, unasked-for sensation of belonging to something. She'd stood very still between 2 rows of shelving. She'd thought, oh, and then, no, not because she knew who it was. She didn't, not for certain, not until the name spread through the court the next morning like weather. She just knew, the way you know when you've wandered into someone else's conversation, when you're in the wrong room, when the door you've opened isn't the one you were meant to open. King Calum Draven, the Alpha King, the man who had ruled the 7 Packs for 6 years, and who had, in that time, established himself as someone you did not miscalculate. Not cruel, that was what people said, with the same small hesitation they used about her face. Not cruel, but precise. A man who made decisions the way other men placed stones on a game board, without sentiment, without waste, with a clarity that looked from the outside like coldness, and from the inside, she imagined, like simple arithmetic. She had never spoken to him. In 3 weeks, she would stand at an altar with him. She counted the remaining days. 21, then 20, then the numbers ran out, the way all countdowns do eventually, and it was morning, and she was in a corridor, and there were 312 candles. Her maid got the ribbon to stay. The ceremony was held at midday, when the light through the high windows came in at an angle that turned everything gold. She walked down the center of the hall with her father on her left. He was sweating through his collar. She could see it. She didn't look at it. And 300 witnesses standing on either side. She had chosen ivory silk, her mother's suggestion. Too formal for the season, too stiff at the shoulders, the kind of dress that wore you rather than the other way around. But her mother had pressed her hands together and said it was dignified, and Sarah had not had the energy to fight about fabric. She reached the dais. He was already there. She had been wrong about him. Not about his face. She'd seen him from a distance before. Twice. At court functions she'd attended in her father's shadow. She'd known what he looked like. What she'd been wrong about was the scale of him, the way he occupied space. He was not especially tall, not the way that made people crane their necks. He was just present in a way that made the concept of the room rearrange itself around him, the ceiling seeming lower where he stood, the air seeming denser. She stopped in front of him. He looked at her. She counted. 1, 2, 3. Not unkindly, not warmly. The way you look at something when you are determining what it is and what it is worth and what, if anything, you are going to do with it. 4, 5, 6. She kept her face still. She was very good at keeping her face still. She had been practicing since she was 7, in the years when keeping it still was the only power she had. 7, 8, 9. The bond in her chest pulled. He had to feel it. She knew he had to feel it. The bond didn't choose sides, didn't favor one person over the other. It was just a fact of their biology, a thread of something ancient and unasked for that ran between two people when the moon decided they were meant. He was feeling what she was feeling. The warmth, the pull, the key in the lock. 10, 11. He said, "I reject you as my mate and queen." The hall breathed in. Nobody breathed out. Sarah stood there. She was aware, in the specific, floating way of someone whose mind has departed its body and gone somewhere safer, of several things at once. She was aware that her father had gone rigid beside her, that her mother, somewhere in the third row of witnesses, had made a small, wounded sound, that the alpha lords at the front of the hall were exchanging glances with the careful, calibrated expressions of men who did not want to be caught reacting. She was aware that the ivory silk was very stiff at her shoulders. She was aware that there were 312 candles. She counted them again, from the left side of the hall, the ones near the windows, the ones in the iron holders along the far wall, 312. Her thought, in the silence that had not ended, that was still going, that seemed to want to go on forever, was very simple. Right. She was good at right. She had been saying it since she was a child, in the small, flat voice she used when something happened that she had no language for and no good reaction to. Right. The verbal equivalent of a shelf, where she put things she would deal with later. The bonding master, a small, nervous man in formal gray robes, stepped forward and spoke the words that made it official. The rejection. The severance, or the attempted severance, because the bond didn't sever cleanly. That wasn't how it worked. You couldn't just say a sentence and dissolve a thing that went that deep. What you could do was crack it, fray the edges, leave it live and frayed and painful, like a wire that had been stripped without being cut. Sarah felt the moment it happened. The warmth didn't vanish. It cracked open at one end and the heat leaked out slowly, like a window left ajar in winter, and what remained was not absence but a kind of hollow, something that had been full, now half empty, still shaped like fullness. She was escorted from the dais, her father's hand on her elbow, gentle, mortified. She let herself be escorted. She kept her face still. She didn't look at anyone, and no one, notably, looked at her. They looked slightly to the left of her, or at the floor near her feet, or at each other, with the particular guilt of people who have witnessed something they will be talking about for years. She counted her steps. 14 to the side door, then 12 down the smaller corridor. Then she was in an antechamber, alone, and the door was shut behind her, and she sat down on a bench that was there for exactly this purpose, a bench for people who needed to sit down, and she put her hands in her lap and looked at the wall. She sat there for a long time. Right, perfect, great. She didn't leave. That was the part that no one expected. Not her family. Her mother had already begun making quiet inquiries about returning home, had already started, Sarah suspected, the mental process of explaining this to everyone they knew, the careful management of the story that would follow. Not the court. People who had been rejected in front of 300 witnesses generally had the dignity to disappear, to remove themselves from the scene of the humiliation, to begin the work of rebuilding somewhere else. Sarah stayed. She went back to the archive the next morning, before the senior clerk arrived. She found the treaty rolls she'd been working on, the ones from the Second Moon War, which nobody had organized properly in 60 years, and which were currently arranged in what appeared to be deliberate mockery of chronological order. And she sat down and she worked. She worked because working was the other thing, besides counting, that gave her somewhere to put herself. The archive was on the lower east side of the palace, below the main hall, adjacent to the old records rooms. It was not the kind of place people visited unless they needed something specific. It smelled like old paper and lamp oil and the specific quiet of a room that had been quiet for a very long time. Sarah had found it 6 months before the bonding ceremony, during a particularly bad week when the palace social calendar had felt like something being done at her rather than around her, and she had walked in looking for a back corridor and found something better. The senior clerk, a man named Aldous, who was 70 years old and had the filing habits of someone who had given up caring about filing approximately 40 years ago, had taken one look at her, handed her a stack of unsorted rolls, and gone back to his desk. That had been the beginning of the best professional relationship of her life. Now she sorted treaties. She cataloged. She learned things. What the borders of the southern lowlands had looked like before the Second Pack War, which territories had changed hands 4 times in 2 centuries, what the old agreements said about the rights of unmated betas in royal courts. That last one she read twice. It turned out, fine. Not fine the way people used that word when they meant the opposite. Fine in the quiet, functional sense. She ate. She slept, mostly. She went to work every morning, and came home every evening, and avoided the parts of the palace where she might be expected to perform a particular kind of dignity, which mostly meant avoiding the staterooms and the main dining hall, and anywhere that alpha lords gathered to discuss pack business. The bond ached. She didn't think about that. She thought about it the way you think about a healing bruise. You don't prod it constantly. You just register its presence when you move a certain way, and then you move a different way, and you go on with what you were doing. It would pass. Things passed. She knew this from experience, and she believed it, with the specific, bleak confidence of someone who has had to believe it many times. What she did not expect was that it would take 17 months. She counted those too. She also sang, not for anyone. Not in public. Not in the way that word usually meant, standing in front of people who were paying attention, performing something. She sang in the archive, late in the evenings, when Aldous had gone home and the candles were burning low, and the only other sound was the occasional creak of the building settling around her. She sang because it was hers. That's the only way she ever thought about it. Not as a talent or a skill or a gift. Those words had other people built into them, implied an audience, implied someone to confirm the thing. She sang because when she was doing it, she was entirely inside herself, inside the sound, and nothing outside could reach her there. Her mother had tried to train it out of her when she was young, not the singing itself. Her mother wasn't cruel, but the way she sang. Too much feeling in it, her mother had said, pressing her lips together. Too unguarded. You could hear everything in her when she sang. Every room she'd ever been alone in, every door that had closed, every time she had kept her face still and gone somewhere else inside herself to survive it. You could hear all of that in 4 bars, and her mother found it alarming, the way people are alarmed by sincerity in public, and had enrolled her in formal lessons with a court musician who had spent 8 months teaching her to sing with more control. She had been a disappointing student. Now she sang between the treaty rolls, in the dark and the lamp oil smell, and the sound went into the stone walls and stayed there. She didn't think of it as practicing. She didn't think of it as anything. The convocation of the 7 packs was the kind of event that happened every 3 years, and that the court spent 6 months dreading and preparing for in equal measure. 7 alpha lords, their advisors, their mates, their various political complications, housed in the palace for a week, fed at the king's table every night, their grievances heard, their alliances managed, their tempers monitored. It required a quantity of logistics that Sarah had only become aware of through the archive. The old convocation records showed exactly how many things had gone wrong in previous years, and the list was, in her professional opinion, extraordinary. There was also music. Specifically, a formal musical performance on the first night, before the political sessions began. Traditional, processional, the kind of thing that said to 7 alpha lords and their various retinues, "You are in the royal court. There is culture here. We are civilized people who do civilized things before we begin arguing about borders." The court's designated singer for this occasion was a woman from the Northern Coast Pack, visiting performer, arranged 6 months in advance, known throughout the Northern Territories for her voice and her composure and her ability to perform under the specific pressure of a room full of pack leaders. 3 days before the convocation, she collapsed with fever. Sarah was in the 4th corridor, the one off the East Archive entrance, carrying a stack of treaty rolls, when the court steward found her, not looking for her specifically. He was moving through the palace at the speed of a man who had passed some personal threshold of stress and was now operating on a kind of frantic autopilot, his formal gray coat open at the collar, his hair in a state that suggested he had been running his hands through it continuously for several hours. He stopped when he saw her. He looked at the treaty rolls. He looked at her. He said, "You sing." It was not a question. It was a statement with the quality of a man who had been told something at some point and was now retrieving it, under desperate circumstances. She said, "Aldous told you. He told someone. It got to me." He was already moving past the question of whether this was appropriate. She could see it in his face. The train of where we are now already departed from the station of how we got here. The Northern Coast singer is ill. The convocation is in 3 days. The first night performance. "No," Sarah said. "I'm not asking." She opened her mouth, closed it, looked at the treaty rolls she was holding, which were the Second Moon War agreements, border disputes between the Eastern Reaches and the Northern Territories, mid-century revision of the Water Rights Clause. She had been carrying them for 15 minutes. They were heavier than they looked. The steward's expression was the expression of a man who had spent his career managing impossible things and had developed, as a survival mechanism, the ability to look at the person standing in front of him as simply the next impossible thing to be managed. He said, 3 days, first night, 30 minutes. She said, "I sing in an archive." He said, "You'll sing in the hall." He was gone before she could find the words for what she actually wanted to say, which was something along the lines of, "I am the woman the king rejected in front of 300 people, and I do not think walking back into that hall is something I am prepared to do for 30 minutes of processional music." She stood in the corridor. The treaty rolls were still heavy. She thought, right, perfect, great. She spent the first day telling herself she wouldn't do it. She spent the second day making a list of every legitimate reason she had to decline, which was a very long list, and which she found, at the end of it, had done nothing useful at all. She spent the third day, the day of the convocation, the day of the evening performance, in the archive, sitting with her back against the shelving, her knees pulled up, the lamp oil smell around her like something familiar. She sang, very quietly, the thing she would have to sing that night. Not the processional piece the steward had given her. She'd looked at that, the formal arrangement, the careful neutral notes of it, the piece designed to be impressive without being intrusive, the musical equivalent of a dignified ivory silk dress that wore you instead of the other way around. She sang what she actually wanted to sing. It was an old thing. She didn't know the exact origin. She'd found it in the archive of all places, in a collection of folk songs from the border territories, written in a script she'd had to cross-reference 3 different historical glossaries to decode. It was not processional. It was not dignified. It was the kind of song that had no interest in composure, that had apparently been sung in the border villages when someone died, or married, or came home from a war, or needed, for whatever reason, to put something enormous into sound. She sang it in the archive, and it went into the stone walls. Then she put on the dress the steward's people had brought her, dark green, better season, actually fit her properly, and she went to the hall. The hall was full in a way it hadn't been since the bonding ceremony. She noticed this without thinking about it, the way you notice things your body registers before your mind catches up. 17 months was not long enough for the hall to be a neutral space. It was probably not going to be long enough for a very long time. But she was here now, in the dark green dress, standing to the side of the dais with her hands loose at her sides, and her face still, and the treaty rolls were not here to hold, and there was nothing to count that wouldn't take too long. 7 alpha lords, their advisors and mates and political complications. The king's court, the permanent fixtures, the lords and ladies and pack representatives who lived in this orbit by choice or by necessity. King Calum Draven at the center of it, at the high table, present in the way that made the room rearrange itself around him. She had not been this close to him since the bonding ceremony. She did not look at him directly. She looked at a point approximately 6 inches to the left of wherever he was, which was a technique she had developed over 17 months, and which served her adequately. The convocation formal proceedings opened. Names were announced. Titles were given. The Alpha Lord from the Eastern Reaches, a man named Gareth, old enough that his gray hair had gone fully white, deliberate in every movement and word, the kind of man who had survived enough politics to find patience genuinely useful, made a formal greeting speech that was 3 minutes long and exactly as diplomatic as it needed to be. Then there was a pause. In the pause, Gareth leaned toward the king and said something. She felt the moment the king's attention moved. She wasn't looking at him, she was looking 6 inches to the left of him. But the bond, the frayed, half-empty, 17-month-old bond, registered it the way it registered everything about him, without her consent, without her preference. A shift, a direction, toward her. She looked. He was looking at her. His expression had not changed in any visible way. He still had the face of a man doing inventory rather than seeing. He still occupied the space around him the way weather occupies a landscape. But he was looking at her, and she was looking at him, and for a moment they were just 2 people in a hall with 300 witnesses and 17 months between them. He said, "Can you sing?" Not loud, not projected. The hall carried it anyway, the hall being the kind of old stone space that was built to carry voices to every corner. Everyone heard it. 300 people heard King Calum Draven ask the woman he had publicly rejected, in this hall, at that altar, with these candles, if she could sing. Sarah stood very still, the bond in her chest pulled, not with warmth this time, with something that did not have a name she wanted to use. She thought, right. She said, yes. A pause. He said, "Are you any good?" She thought about the treaty rolls, about the archive, about the old folk song from the border territories, the one in the script she'd had to cross-reference 3 glossaries to decode, about 17 months of singing for stone walls, because stone walls do not reject you or look at you like inventory, or require you to perform any particular kind of dignity. She tilted her head. Just slightly, just the specific angle of a woman who has decided something and is no longer arguing with herself about it. She said, "I suppose you'll find out." The walk to the center of the dais was the longest walk she had ever taken, not because it was far. It wasn't, maybe 20 feet, from where she had been standing to the spot where the lighting from the high chandeliers pooled most densely on the floor. 20 feet. She counted her steps. She did not think about the altar, which was still there, slightly to the left, where it lived permanently. She did not think about ivory silk, or 11 seconds, or the small wounded sound her mother had made from the 3rd row. She did not think about Calum, behind her, watching with the expression of a man doing inventory. She did not think about the bond. She stood in the center of the dais. The hall was already quiet, but now it became a different kind of quiet. Not the working quiet of a formal event, pausing between its parts, but the specific hush of 300 people who have collectively made a decision, not to speak, not to move, not to be the one who broke whatever was about to happen. She was aware of the Alpha Lord Gareth at the high table, his hands flat on the wood in front of him. She was aware of the court lords in the first rows, their careful, calibrated faces. She was aware of the candles. She didn't count them this time, she just registered them. All that light, all that warmth, pointing at her. She opened her mouth. She sang the processional piece. For 2 bars. Then she stopped. The hall registered the stop with a barely perceptible shift. Not sound, not movement, just the collective awareness of something having changed. She stood for a moment in the stopped place. The stone walls of the archive were not here. The lamp oil smell was not here. The treaty rolls were not here. There was just the hall and the light and 300 people and the frayed wire in her chest pulling toward the high table where a man was watching her with an expression she wasn't looking at. She sang the border song, the one with no interest in composure. The one from the folk collection, written in the script she'd had to decode, that had apparently been sung in the villages when someone needed to put something enormous into sound. It was not what the steward had given her. It was not processional. It was not dignified in the ivory silk way. It was what she had been doing alone in the archive for 17 months, which was telling the truth in a room where no one could hear it, which she had not known until right now she had been preparing to tell in a room where everyone could. The sound came out different than it did in the archive. In the archive, it absorbed into stone and paper and old treaties. In the hall it went up. The high ceilings caught it and turned it back, layered it, gave it back to her amplified and somehow also accompanied, the way old stone halls built for exactly this purpose will sometimes give your voice back to you, sounding like more than you are. She had not known it would sound like this. She sang. She did not think about how she looked. She did not think about composure or control or the 8 months of lessons meant to take the too much feeling out of it. She thought about the border villages and the marriages and the homecomings from wars and all the things that are enormous and need to go somewhere. She sang all of it, the hollow in her chest, the 17 months, the 2 stiff shoulders of a dress chosen for dignity, the archive and the lamplight and the treaty rolls, and the specific sound the hall had made when 300 people breathed in and did not breathe out. She sang all of it, not because she decided to, not because she planned it, but because the song was built for exactly this, for the things that were too large for rooms. She sang. The silence after was not the same silence as before. She knew this before she even fully stopped. The last note had not finished traveling to the far walls when she knew that what was happening in the room was something different from what had happened 17 months ago. Before, the silence had been the silence of something being absorbed, people taking in a shock, processing it, working out how to hold their faces. This was not that silence. This silence had weight, the specific weight of a room full of people who have heard something they did not expect to hear, and who are, in this moment, in the strange, temporary space of not having yet decided how to respond. She stood in the center of the dais. She lowered her hands. She counted. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Gareth, the Alpha Lord from the Eastern Reaches, the old deliberate man who had survived enough politics to find patience genuinely useful, set both hands flat on the table. He had been sitting. He stood. She watched this with the floating, slightly disbelieving attention of someone observing something from inside a dream. The Alpha of the Southern Lowlands stood. He was a man who had attended 3 previous convocations in which Sarah had once catalogued the records, and in those records she had found no notation of him standing for any occasion, formal or otherwise. He stood now, one by one, not all at once, not the theatrical sweep of a room rising together, which would have been almost too much to hold. One by one, like a tide coming in, like the way cold spreads in a room not dramatically but inevitably, the Alpha Lords and their advisors, and the court residents, and the people who had been standing along the walls. One by one, she kept her eyes forward, straight ahead, to the back wall of the hall where the oldest tapestry hung, the one depicting the First Pack Agreement, which she had spent 3 weeks last winter cross-referencing against the archive records, and which she could now identify errors in from 20 feet away. She looked at the tapestry. She breathed. She felt, through the frayed wire, through the crack, through 17 months of a bond she had been trying to treat like a healing bruise, that at the high table, King Calum Draven had gone very still. She was almost to the corridor when he found her. Almost. 6 steps from the side exit, the one that led to the antechamber, and then the smaller halls, and eventually, if you went east and down, to the archive. The archive, where it was quiet, and it smelled like lamp oil, and she could go between the shelves and sit on the floor and not be seen. 6 steps. She heard her name. Not her title, not Miss Voss, which was the correct formal address for a beta daughter who had been publicly rejected and was now technically nothing in particular. Her name, her given name, which he would have only from the bonding ceremony records, which she had not heard him say before. She stopped. She did not turn around immediately. She let herself stand there for a moment, just the length of a breath, because the alternative was to turn and face him before she had arranged herself, and she had spent 17 months not being arranged enough, and she was not going to let that be the thing that defeated her now. She turned. He was close, closer than she'd expected. He'd moved fast, or she'd stopped sooner than she thought. One of the two. Up close he looked less like a weather event, and more like a person, which was somehow more alarming. He was holding his formal gloves in his left hand. She noticed this in the way she noticed irrelevant things when her mind was doing something else. Her eyes finding the gloves the way they would have found the treaty rolls, the specific, displaced attention of a person with too much to hold. He said, "I didn't know." She waited. She did not help him. She had spent a great deal of her life helping people say things to her that she already knew they were going to say, filling in the silences, making it easier, and she was done with that now. He said, at the ceremony, "I didn't know." She said, "That I could sing? That you were—" He stopped, started again. He had the specific clumsiness of a man who made decisions with enormous precision and was now in a situation where precision was not available. "I didn't look. I saw what I expected to see. A beta's daughter, an alliance arrangement. I didn't—" "Look," she said. "No." He said it the same way she might have said right, flat, without excuse. As close to honest as a word could be, when it was also its own verdict. The bond flared. Not the frayed warmth, something sharper than that. Something that had been living in the cracked, half-empty space for 17 months and had apparently been waiting for exactly this. An honest word, undefended, from the man who had caused the crack. She stood very still. Don't, she thought, not to him, to herself. Don't turn this into something it isn't yet. Don't let one honest word undo 17 months of learning to be enough on your own. She said, "No, it is different." He was quiet. So she looked at him, actually looked, the way she hadn't looked across an altar 17 months ago, the way she'd been counting candles instead, keeping her face still, waiting for something she'd known on some level was not going to go the way she'd hoped. She looked at him now. He had a cut above his left eyebrow from training, she noticed. An old one, going silver. He had the eyes of someone who had made a great many decisions and was not naive about the cost of any of them. He did not ask her to forgive him. She had thought, in the various versions of this conversation she had run through her mind over 17 months, mostly late at night, in the way the mind entertains humiliations it cannot stop imagining, that forgiveness would be the thing he'd want. An apology, delivered cleanly, accepted cleanly, the ledger balanced. He didn't ask. She was not sure, standing there, whether that was better or worse. The bond was alive between them, not restored. It had been frayed too long for that. The edges had healed wrong. They would have to build something new if they were going to build anything at all. But alive, inconveniently, undeniably, without her permission or his, alive. She said, "I'm not in the habit of walking backwards." He said, "I'm not asking you to." She looked at him for another moment. The cut above his eye, the gloves in his left hand. The specific expression of a man who has calculated very precisely what he deserves and has no intention of asking for more. She said, "Good." She turned. She walked. 6 steps, then the side exit, then the antechamber and the smaller corridors, and the East Hall, and eventually the stairs down to the archive. She did not run. She walked the way she had always walked, since she was 7 years old, and counting the steps between her bedroom and the kitchen, keeping to the wall, where the floorboards were steady, where the ground held. Behind her, in the hall, the candles were still burning, all 312 of them. She had not counted them tonight. She hadn't needed to. She already knew. She was at her desk in the archive when Aldous arrived the next morning. He was 20 minutes later than usual, which meant he'd heard the news from somewhere, which meant the news was moving fast. He came in with his coat half-buttoned and looked at her the way he had looked at her every morning for 17 months, which was with the specific, undemonstrative steadiness of an old man who had been around long enough to know that the best thing you could do for most people was just continue to show up. He said, "The Southern Lowlands Alpha sent a message to the king this morning." She sorted treaties. He said, "Gareth of the Eastern Reaches sent 2. "I know," she said. "The archive gets copies." He sat down at his desk. He pulled a stack of his own unsorted rolls toward him. He began to work. After a moment, without looking up, he said, "You should have done that months ago." She set down the roll she was holding. She thought about this. She thought about 17 months, about the hollow, and the frayed wire, and the ivory silk, about 312 candles, and 11 seconds, and the 2 stiff shoulders of a dress, chosen for someone else's idea of dignity. She thought about the stone walls of the archive, and the old border song, and the way the high ceiling of the hall had given her voice back to her, sounding like more than she was. She thought, the stone walls had always given it back that way. She just hadn't been in a room with a ceiling before. She said, I suppose I wasn't ready. Aldous said, He sorted his roles. She sorted hers. Outside, past the archive walls, past the palace corridors and the formal halls and the staterooms, the convocation of the 7 packs was beginning its second day. Alpha lords were gathering around long tables. Political complications were being managed. Border disputes were being heard and assessed and written into the careful, permanent language of new agreements that would eventually, years from now, make their way down here, to the archive, where someone would catalog them and store them in the right order so they could be found again when they were needed. She would be here when they arrived. She was good at that. 3 weeks later, a message arrived at the archive. Plain paper, the king's seal, addressed formally to Sarah Voss, archival assistant, East Records. Not Miss Voss, not the rejected Bond, not the careful diplomatic nothing of a title given to someone who had been publicly set aside. Her name. She held the letter for a long time without opening it. She sat between 2 rows of shelving, in the lamplight, with the treaty rolls around her and the smell of old paper and the particular quiet of a room that had been quiet for a very long time. She thought about walking backwards. She thought about building something new from frayed edges. She thought about a song she'd been singing into stone walls for 17 months, not knowing it was practice. Then she opened the letter. What it said was brief, a formal request. Her presence at a meeting, 3 days hence, in the small council room on the west side of the palace. Not the great hall, not the staterooms, but the small council room, which the archive records indicated had been used, historically, for conversations that were not yet ready to be witnessed. At the bottom, below the formal language, below the seal, in handwriting that was smaller than she expected from a man who occupied space the way he did. Bring your own chair if you'd prefer. I've been told mine is uncomfortable. She read that twice. She looked at the ceiling. The archive ceiling was low, old stone, not built for anything to travel very far. She set the letter down. She thought. She had always been good at learning things, especially the things people did not think to hide from someone they'd already dismissed. She thought he had stopped dismissing her. She thought that was not the same as trusting him, was not the same as forgiveness, which was not a door you threw open, but a thing you built slowly, one agreement at a time, in small rooms with uncomfortable chairs, with no witnesses except the person you were building it with. She picked up the letter again. She set it carefully in the correct file, the personal correspondence folder, which she had established for exactly this kind of thing, because she was an archivist, and that was what archivists did. Then she went back to the Second Moon War treaties, which still needed sorting. She had 3 days. She had work to do. She sat down. She counted. 1. The bond did not repair itself overnight. The frayed edges did not simply knit back together because a man said something honest in a corridor. She knew that. She had always known that. Known it the way you know the floorboard map of your own house, through repetition and consequence, through all the times you had stepped wrong and heard the creak. What changed in the weeks and months that followed was slower and less dramatic than any of the stories told about it later. And there were stories, because there are always stories, because 300 people had been in that hall and they all had mouths and memories. The stories said, the rejected bride sang and the king fell. The stories said, the bond mended, the queen was crowned, the court learned a lesson about what it means to look. The truth was more like the archive, quiet, requiring patience, full of things that had to be sorted into the right order before they could be found again. She attended the meeting in the small council room. She brought her own chair. He noticed. He didn't say anything about it. She appreciated that more than she would have appreciated almost anything else he could have done. They talked. Not about the bond, not at first, about the Eastern Reaches border dispute, which she had, it turned out, spent 6 weeks cataloging the historical precedents for, and which he had been trying to resolve for 2 years on the basis of information that was, she informed him, approximately 60 years out of date. He was quiet for a moment. He said, "How do you know that?" She said, "I work in the archive." He said, "I know where you work." She said, "Then you should know that the archive has the 1847 territorial revision records, which no one has apparently looked at since 1849, which is a significant oversight if you are trying to settle a border dispute based on 1847 conditions." He looked at her, not the inventory look, something else, the look of a man encountering something he had not expected and was revising his position in real time. He said, "Would you be willing to brief the council?" She said, "I'll need to bring materials from the archive." He said, "I'll arrange access." She said, "I already have access. I work there." Another pause, and then, and this was the thing she came back to, later, more than the bonding ceremony, or the hall, or the corridor, the corner of his mouth moved. Not a smile. The beginning of one, the hesitant kind that hasn't committed yet. She thought he hadn't looked at her across the altar because he hadn't expected to find anything worth looking at. She thought he was looking now. She thought that was not enough, and also it was a beginning. And also, she was not the same person who had stood in that hall counting candles, and she was not going back to being her, and he was going to have to learn to see whoever she was now, which was someone who brought her own chair and knew the 1847 territorial revision records and sang border songs into stone ceilings, because she had learned that the sound came back larger than it left. That was the real story. Not the silence after the song, not the alpha lords standing one by one, not even the corridor, and the honest word, and the bond flaring back to life in the frayed space where warmth had once been. The real story was everything that came after. The slow, unglamorous, necessary work of two people building something new from edges that had healed wrong, in a small room with uncomfortable chairs, with no witnesses but each other. She was good at that kind of work. She had always been good at it. She just hadn't known, until she sang in a hall where the ceiling was high enough to give the sound back, that she had been practicing for it all along.